For a general discussion of skepticism, see skepticism. Philosophical skepticism is both a philosophical school of thought and a method that crosses disciplines and cultures. It is generally agreed that knowledge requires justification. It is not enough to have a true belief. One must also have good reasons for the belief. Skeptics claim that it is not possible to have an adequate justification. Skepticism is not a single position but covers a range of different positions. In the ancient world there were two main skeptical traditions. Academic skepticism took the dogmatic position that knowledge was not possible. Pyrrhonian skeptics refused to take a dogmatic position on any issue, including skepticism. Radical skepticism ends in the paradoxical claim that one cannot know anything, including that one cannot know about knowing anything. Skepticism can be classified according to its scope. Local skepticism involves being skeptical about particular areas of knowledge, e.g., moral skepticism, skepticism about the external world, or skepticism about other minds, whereas global skepticism is skeptical about the possibility of any knowledge at all. Skepticism can also be classified according to its method. In the Western tradition there are two basic approaches to skepticism. Cartesian skepticism, named somewhat misleadingly after René Descartes, who was not a skeptic but used some traditional skeptical arguments in his meditations to help establish his rationalist approach to knowledge. Attempts to show that any proposed knowledge claim can be doubted. Agrippan skepticism focuses on the process of justification rather than the possibility of doubt. According to this view, there are three ways in which one might attempt to justify a claim, but none of them are adequate. One can keep on providing further justification, but this leads to an infinite regress. One can stop at a dogmatic assertion, or one can argue in circular reasoning, never reaching a viable conclusion. Philosophical skepticism is distinguished from methodological skepticism in that philosophical skepticism is an approach that questions the possibility of certainty in knowledge, whereas methodological skepticism is an approach that subjects all knowledge claims to scrutiny with the goal of sorting out true from false claims. For the perspective of cognitive science, a philosophically skeptical attitude can be considered as either low valence or ambivalence. History. Ancient Eastern skepticism. Ajnana were the skeptical school of ancient Indian philosophy. It was a Sramana movement and a major rival of early Buddhism and Jainism. They have been recorded in Buddhist and Jain texts. They held that it was impossible to obtain knowledge of metaphysical nature or ascertain the truth value of philosophical propositions, and even if knowledge was possible, it was useless and disadvantageous for final salvation. Buddhism. Buddhist skepticism is not concerned with whether a thing exists or not. The Zen masters would answer questions, koans, with seemingly unrelated responses such as hitting the student. This would serve as a means of pulling the student back from the confusion of intellectual pontification, and into a direct experience. Since in Zen, all there is a direct experience, which cannot be explained or clarified beyond the experience itself. This answers the question. Buddha is said to have touched the earth at the time of his enlightenment so that it could witness his enlightenment. In this way, Buddhism does not claim that knowledge is unattainable. Buddhism places less emphasis on truth and knowledge than Western philosophical skepticism. Instead, it emphasizes the goal of body, which, although often translated as enlightenment, does not imply truth or knowledge, at least in its manifestation of Nagarjuna's texts that form the core of Madhyamaka. The anti-essentialist aspect of Buddhism makes it an anti-philosophy. For that stance, truth exists solely within the contexts that assert them. Carvaka philosophy. The Carvaka school of skepticism, also known as Lokayata, is a distinct branch of Indian philosophy. The school is named after Carvaka, author of the Bahaspacha Sutras, and was founded in approximately 500 BC. Carvaka is classified as a heterodox system, characterized as a materialistic and atheistic school of thought. Jain philosophy of Anekantavada and Syadavada. Anekantavada, also known as the principle of relative pluralism, is one of the basic principles of Jainism. According to this, the truth of the reality is perceived differently from different points of view, and that no single point of view is the complete truth. Jain doctrine states that an object has infinite modes of existence and qualities, and, as such, they cannot be completely perceived in all its aspects and manifestations, due to inherent limitations of the humans. Anekantavada is literally the doctrine of non-one-sidedness or manifoldness. It is often translated as non-absolutism. Syadvada is the theory of conditioned predication, which provides an expression to Anekanta by recommending that epithet Syad be attached to every expression. Syadvada is not only an extension of Anekanta ontology, but a separate system of logic capable of standing on its own force. As reality is complex, no single proposition can express the nature of reality fully. Thus the term SYT should be prefixed before each proposition, giving it conditional point of view and thus removing any dogmatism in the statement. The seven propositions, also known as Saptabhamya Syad Asti, in some ways it is. Syad Nasti, in some ways it is not. Syad Asti Nasti, in some ways it is and it is not. Syad Asya Vaktavya, in some ways it is and it is indescribable. Syad Nasti Vaktavya, in some ways it is not and it is indescribable. Syad Asti Nasti Vaktavya, in some ways it is not and it is indescribable. Syad Vaktavya, in some ways it is indescribable. Each of these seven propositions examines the complex and multifaceted reality from a relative point of view of time, space, substance and mode. To ignore the complexity of the objects is to commit the fallacy of dogmatism. For a rigorous logical and mathematical interpretation, C.M.K. Jain, Logic of Evidence-Based Inference Propositions, Current Science, 1663–1672, 100. Chinese philosophy. In China, the preeminent dualist work Zhuangzi, attributed to 4th century BC philosopher Zhuangzi during the 100 Schools of Thought period, is skeptical in nature and provides also two famous skeptical paradoxes: the happiness of fish, and Zhuangzi dreamed he was a butterfly. Wang Chong introduced a form of naturalism based on a rational critique of the superstition that was overtaking Confucianism and Daoism in the 1st century CE. His neo-dualist philosophy was based on a secular, rational practice not unlike the scientific method. Islam. In Islamic theology and Islamic philosophy, the scholar Al-Ghazali is considered a pioneer of methodic doubt and skepticism. His 11th century book titled The Incoherence of the Philosophers marks a major turn in Islamic epistemology, as Ghazali effectively discovered a methodic form of philosophical skepticism that would not be commonly seen in the West until René Descartes, George Berkeley and David Hume. The encounter with skepticism led Ghazali to embrace a form of theological occasionalism, or the belief that all causal events and interactions are not the product of material conjunctions but rather the immediate and present will of God. While he himself was a critic of the philosophies, Ghazali was a master in the art of philosophy and had immensely studied the field. After such a long education in philosophy, as well as a long process process of reflection, he had criticized the philosophical method. The autobiography Ghazali wrote towards the end of his life, "The Deliverance from Error," is considered a work of major importance. In it, Ghazali recounts how, once a crisis of epistemological skepticism was resolved by a light which God Most High cast into my breast. The key to most knowledge, he studied and mastered the arguments of Kalam, Islamic philosophy, and Ishmaelism. Though appreciating what was valid in the first two of these, at least, he determined that all three approaches were inadequate and found ultimate value only in the mystical experience and spiritual insight he attained. As a result of following Sufi practices, William James, in Varieties of Religious Experience, considered the autobiography an important document for the purely literary student who would like to become acquainted with the inwardness of religions other than the Christian. Comparing it to recorded personal religious confessions and autobiographical literature in the Christian tradition, scholars have noted the similarities between Descartes' Discourse on Method and Ghazali's work, and the writer George Henry Lewis went even further, by claiming that, had any translation of it in the days of Descartes existed, everyone would have cried out against the plagiarism. Ancient Western skepticism. The Western tradition of systematic skepticism goes back at least as far as Pyrrho of Elis. However, the 5th-century sophists developed forms of debate which are ancestors of skeptical argumentation. They take pride in arguing in a persuasive fashion for both sides of an issue. There were many disputes that could be found within the philosophical schools of his day, and according to a later account of his life by his student Timon of Phlius, Pyrrho extolled a way to become happy and tranquil. Timon is reported as telling us that in order to be happy, one must pay attention to three connected questions. First, what are things like by nature? Second, how should we be disposed towards things? And third, what will be the outcome for those who adopt the disposition recommended in the answer to the second question? In considering what things are like by nature, Pyrrho, believing that equal arguments can be offered on both sides of any proposition, dismissed the search for truth as a vain endeavor. Given this, Pyrrho says that sense experience and beliefs are in fact neither true nor false. His words seem to suggest that verifiability is a necessary condition of truth for our attitude towards things. Pyrrho is reported as saying that since our sense experiences and beliefs are neither true nor false, therefore, we ought not to put our trust in them, but be without beliefs, disinclined to take our stand one way or the other, and steadfast in this attitude. Quote, "This attitude to life would eventually lead the skeptic to a state of atraxia, or freedom from distress and worry." Pyrrho and his school were not actually skeptics in the latest sense of the word. They had the goal of alpha tau alpha rho alpha chi iota alpha, and pitted one dogmatic philosophy against the next to undermine belief in the whole philosophic enterprise. The idea was to produce in the student a state of aversion towards what the Pyrrhonists considered arbitrary and inconsequential babble, since no one can observe or otherwise experience causation, external world, ultimate purpose of the universal life, justice, divinity, soul, etc. They declared no need to believe in such things. The Pyrrhonists pointed out that, despite claims that such notions were necessary, some people ignorant of them get by just fine before learning about them. They further noted that science does not require belief and that faith in intelligible realities is different from pragmatic convention for the sake of experiment. For each intuitive notion, the Pyrrhonists cited a contrary opinion to negate it. They added that consensus indicates neither truth nor even probability. For example, the Earth is round, and it would remain so even if everyone believed it were flat. The opposite might also be the case. The goal of this critique, which Pyrrho's followers realized would ultimately subvert even their own method, was to cultivate a distrust of all grand talk. They expected philosophy to collapse into itself. How far in this direction the Pyrrhonian commitment extended is a matter of debate. The Pyrrhonists confessed a belief in appearances, e.g., in hot and cold, grief and joy. It is impossible to deny, they admitted, that one seems to be in pain or seems to touch a piece of wood. The world, thus, was completely phenomenological. An accomplished Pyrrhonist could, ideally, live as well as a dogmatist, but with the added benefit of not worrying about truth and falsity, right and wrong, God's will, and so forth. Later thinkers took up Pyrrho's approach and extended it into modern skepticism. In the process, a split appeared within the movement, never too large or well-liked among the literati to begin with. In the academic skepticism of the newer Middle Academy, Archelaus and Carneades argued from Stoic premises that the Stoics were actually committed to denying the possibility of knowledge, but seemed to maintain nothing themselves. But Clitomachus, a student of Carneades, interpreted his teacher's philosophy as suggesting an early probabilistic account of knowledge. The Roman politician and philosopher Cicero also seems to have been a supporter of the probabilistic position attributed to the Middle Academy, even if the return to a more dogmatic orientation of that school was already beginning to take place. Diogenes Laertius lists 10 modes of reasoning which Pyrrhonists thought justified the position. 1. Some things give animals pleasure which give other animals pain. What is useful to one animal is harmful to another. 2. Each human has a different assortment of preferences, abilities and interests. 3. Each sense gives a different impression of the same object. 4. There is no reason to think one is sane while others are insane. The opposite could be true. 5. Cultures disagree regarding beauty, truth, goodness, religion, life and justice. 6. There is no consistency in perception. 7. The senses can be shown to be deceptive. 8. Things that strengthen in moderation will weaken when taken in excess, like wine and food. 9. When a thing is rare, it surprises people. When a thing is common, it does not surprise people. 10. Interrelations among things are of course relative, and by themselves are unknowable. In the centuries to come, the words academician and Pyrrhonist would often be used to mean generally skeptic, often ignoring historical changes and distinctions between denial of knowledge and avoidance of belief, between degree of belief and absolute belief, and between possibility and probability. Sextus Empiricus. Sextus Empiricus, the main authority for Pyrrhonian skepticism, worked outside the academy, which by his time had ceased to be a skeptical or probabilistic school and argued in a different direction, incorporating aspects of empiricism into the basis for evaluating knowledge, but without the insistence on experience as the absolute standard of it. Sextus's empiricism was limited to the absolute minimum, already mentioned, that there seemed to be appearances. He developed this basic thought of Pyrrho's into lengthy arguments, most of them directed against Stoics and Epicureans, but also the academic skeptics. The common anti-skeptical argument is that if one knows nothing, one cannot know that one knows nothing, and so may know something after all. It is worth noting that such an argument only succeeds against the complete denial of the possibility of knowledge. Considering dogmatic the claims both to know and not to know, Sextus and his followers claimed neither. Instead, despite the apparent conflict with the goal of ataraxia, they claimed to continue searching for something that might be knowable. Empiricus, as the most systematic author of the works by Hellenistic skeptics which have survived, noted that there are at least 10 modes of skepticism. These modes may be broken down into three categories. One may be skeptical of the subjective perceiver of the objective world, and the relation between perceiver and the world. His arguments are as follows. Subjectively, both the powers of the senses and of reasoning may vary among different people, and since knowledge is a product of one of the other, and since neither are reliable, knowledge would seem to be in trouble. For instance, a color-blind person sees the world quite differently from everyone else. Moreover, one cannot even give preference on the basis of the power of reason, i.e., by treating the rational animal as a carrier of greater knowledge than the irrational animal, since the irrational animal is still adept at navigating their environment, which suggests the ability to know about some aspects of the environment. Secondly, the personality of the individual might also influence what they observe, since preferences are based on sense impressions. Differences in preferences can be attributed to differences in the way that people are affected by the object. Third, the perceptions of each individual sense seemingly have nothing in common with the other senses, i.e., the color red has little to do with the feeling of touching a red object. This is manifest when our senses disagree with each other. For example, a mirage presents certain visible features, but is not responsive to any other kind of sense. In that case, our other senses defeat the impressions of sight. But one may also be lacking enough powers of sense to understand the world in its entirety. If one had an extra sense, then one might know of things in a way that the present five senses are unable to advise us of. Given that our senses can be shown to be unreliable by appealing to other senses, and so our senses may be incomplete, then it follows that all of our senses may be unreliable. Fourth, our circumstances when one perceives anything may be either natural or unnatural, i.e., one may be either in a state of wakefulness or sleep. But it is entirely possible that things in the world really are exactly as they appear to be to those in unnatural states. One can have reasons for doubt that are based on the relationship between objective facts and subjective experience. The positions, distances, and places of objects would seem to affect how they are perceived by the person. For instance, the portico may appear tapered when viewed from one end, but symmetrical when viewed at the other, and these features are different, because they are different features. To believe the object has both properties at the same time is to believe it has two contradictory properties. Since this is absurd, one must suspend judgment about what properties it possesses due to the contradictory experiences. One may also observe that the things one perceives are in a sense polluted by experience. Any given perception, say, of a chair, will always be perceived within some context or other. Since this is the case, one often only speaks of ideas as they occur in the context of the other things that are paired with it, and therefore, one can never know of the true nature of the thing, but only how it appears to us in context. Along the same lines, the skeptic may insist that all things are relative by arguing that absolute appearances either differ from relative appearances or they do not. If absolutes do not differ from relatives, then they are themselves relative. But if absolutes do differ from relatives, then they are relative, because all things that differ must differ from something, and to differ from something is to be relative to something. Finally, one has reason to disbelieve that one knows anything by looking at problems in understanding objects by themselves. Things, when taken individually, may appear to be very different from when they are in mass quantities. For instance, the shavings of a goat's horn are white when taken alone, yet the horn intact is black. Schools of philosophical skepticism. Philosophical skepticism begins with the claim that the skeptic currently does not have knowledge. Some adherents maintain that knowledge is, in theory, possible. It could be argued that Socrates held that view. He appears to have thought that if people continue to ask questions they might eventually come to have knowledge, but that they did not have it yet. Some skeptics have gone further and claimed that true knowledge is impossible. For example, the academic school in ancient Greece well after the time of Carneades. A third skeptical approach would be neither to accept nor reject the possibility of knowledge. Skepticism can be either about everything or about particular areas. A global skeptic argues that he does not absolutely know anything to be either true or false. Academic global skepticism has great difficulty in supporting this claim while maintaining philosophical rigor, since it seems to require that nothing can be known, except for the knowledge that nothing can be known. Though in its probabilistic form it can use and support the notion of weight of evidence. Thus, some probabilists avoid extreme skepticism by maintaining that they merely are reasonably certain some things are real or true. As for using probabilistic arguments to defend skepticism, in a sense this enlarges or increases skepticism, while the defense of empiricism by empiricus weakens skepticism and strengthens dogmatism by alleging that sensory appearances are beyond doubt. Much later, Kant would redefine dogmatism to make indirect realism about the external world seem objectionable, while many Hellenists outside of Empiricus would maintain that everyone who is not skeptical about everything is a dogmatist. This position would seem too extreme for most later philosophers. Nevertheless, a Pyrrhonian global skeptic labors under no such modern constraint, since he only alleged that he, personally, did not know anything and made no statement about the possibility of knowledge. Nor did Archelaus feel bound, since he merely corrected Socrates's "I only know that I know nothing" by adding "I don't even know that," thus more fully rejecting dogmatism. Local skeptics deny that people can have knowledge of a particular area. They may be skeptical about the possibility of one form of knowledge without doubting other forms. Different kinds of local skepticism may emerge, depending on the area. A person may doubt the truth value of different types of journalism, for example, depending on the types of media they trust. In Islamic philosophy, skepticism was established by Al-Ghazali, known in the West as Al-Ghazal, as part of the Ash'ari school of Islamic theology. Francisco Sanchez says that nothing is known as one of the crucial texts of Renaissance skepticism.